The Rouge River had been rising for 2 days. On the evening of April 7, 1947, flood waters swept through Dearborn, Michigan, toppling telephone poles and swallowing the banks where Henry Ford had once watched his wife hunt for fish. The river that powered his estate now turned against it. Somewhere beneath the swollen current, the turbines of his private hydroelectric plant fell silent. The lights went out. Inside the 56-room mansion called Fair Lane, servants lit candles and kerosene lamps. Firelight flickered against limestone walls. The man who had put America on wheels, who had helped electrify a nation, now lay in a bedroom illuminated only by flame. He was 83 years old. Henry Ford had built Fair Lane to be self-sufficient. Its powerhouse generated enough electricity to supply not just the estate but part of the surrounding town. For over 30 years, the system had never failed. Now, on the night he needed it most, the river he had harnessed refused to obey. Clara Ford, his wife of 59 years, sat beside him. The telephone lines were down. When Henry complained of feeling unwell, she sent the chauffeur into the storm to find a doctor. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The man who had transformed the 20th century died in conditions that would have been familiar to his parents in 1863. No electricity, no modern machinery, just candlelight and the sound of water rushing past in the darkness. This is the story of that house, how it came to be built, what it meant to the man who created it, and why in the end even the river could not save him. To understand the fortress of Fair Lane, one must first understand the woman who made its existence possible. Clara Bryant was not the kind of woman who waited for life to happen. Born on April 11, 1866, in Wayne County, Michigan, she grew up on a farm where practicality mattered more than poetry. As the eldest daughter in a family of 10 children, she learned to cook and clean before she learned to dream. But dream she did. At social gatherings common to rural farming communities, dances held at inns and taverns, Clara watched and listened and formed her own opinions about the young men who asked her to waltz. She met Henry Ford at one of these dances in 1885. She was 19 years old. He was 22, a thin young man with intense eyes who talked about machines the way other men talked about horses. Where others saw an oddity, Clara saw possibility. Henry had grown up on a farm in nearby Springwells Township, but he had never loved the work the way his father expected. While other boys competed to see who could plow the straightest furrow, Henry dismantled watches to understand their mechanisms. At 16, he left home to find work in Detroit, apprenticing at machine shops and learning everything he could about engines and mechanics. By the time he met Clara, he had already repaired Westinghouse steam engines across southern Michigan. He spoke of building a horseless carriage, a vehicle that would run on gasoline and change how people traveled. Most young women in 1885 would have dismissed such talk as fantasy. Clara did not. They were engaged in 1886 and married 2 years later on April 11, 1888, Clara's 22nd birthday. The ceremony took place at her parents' home. For their first residence, Henry used lumber he cut and milled himself from family farmland to construct a small house Clara had designed. They called it the Square House, though some knew it as the Honeymoon House. It would be the second of 15 homes the couple would occupy during their marriage. Henry's father had given them farmland as a wedding gift, and for 3 years the young couple lived the life expected of them. But Henry spent his evenings in a small workshop, tinkering with engines rather than tending crops. Clara brought him meals while he worked. She held lanterns so he could see. When neighbors whispered that her husband was wasting his time on foolish contraptions, she said nothing to discourage him. In September 1891, the Fords made a decision that would alter everything. They left the farm and moved to Detroit, where Henry had accepted a position as an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company. Clara packed up their belongings and followed him into an uncertain future, trading the security of farmland for a series of rented rooms in a growing industrial city. The work at Edison suited Henry. Within 2 years, he had risen to chief engineer, a position that gave him both steady income and flexible hours. More importantly, it gave him time to pursue his obsession. In a brick shed behind their rented house on Bagley Avenue, Henry assembled his first gasoline engine. Clara was there on Christmas Eve 1893 when he finished it. She dripped gasoline into the intake while Henry spun the flywheel. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life in their kitchen, filling the room with noise and fumes. It was not the kind of Christmas gift most wives would appreciate. Clara called it wonderful. Their son, Edsel, had been born just weeks earlier on November 6. Clara now had an infant to care for and a husband who disappeared into his workshop every night. She never complained. When colleagues at Edison questioned whether Henry's automobile experiments would ever amount to anything, Clara remained steadfast. Henry later gave her a title that would follow her through history. He called her the Believer. By 1896, Henry had constructed his first complete vehicle, a contraption he named the quadricycle. 4 bicycle wheels, a buggy frame, a small gasoline engine. It was crude and unreliable and shook violently at any speed above walking pace, but it moved under its own power. Clara watched from the doorway as her husband drove it through the pre-dawn streets of Detroit, testing what years of late nights and borrowed tools had created. She had believed in him when no one else did. She would continue believing for the next 50 years through failures and fortunes, through fame that neither of them anticipated. The woman who had learned to be practical on a Michigan farm would stand beside Henry Ford as he built an empire, raised a family, and eventually constructed a house on the Rouge River that was meant to last forever. The quadricycle that Henry Ford drove through Detroit in June 1896 weighed about 500 pounds. It had no reverse gear, and the steering mechanism was a simple tiller like something from a boat. When Ford wanted to show it to potential investors, he had to drive around the block because he could not back up. It was, by any reasonable measure, a primitive machine. But Henry Ford saw in it something more than nuts and bolts. He saw the future. The problem was convincing anyone else. Ford spent the next several years chasing that future while it slipped repeatedly through his fingers. In 1899, a group of Detroit businessmen formed the Detroit Automobile Company around Ford's designs. The venture collapsed within 2 years. Investors wanted cars they could sell immediately, while Ford wanted to keep refining, improving, and perfecting. He refused to release a vehicle until he considered it ready, and the businessmen ran out of patience. A second attempt followed in 1901, but the Henry Ford Company lasted even less time. Ford clashed with his financial backers over the direction of the enterprise, and when they brought in an outside consultant to evaluate his work, Ford walked away entirely. The company he abandoned reorganized itself around that consultant's ideas and eventually became Cadillac. 2 failures in 3 years would have broken most men, but Ford built a racing car instead. He called it the 999 after a famous locomotive. The machine was dangerous, loud, and spectacularly fast. Ford himself refused to race it at high speeds, so he recruited a bicycle racer named Barney Oldfield to drive. Oldfield had never operated an automobile before, but within days, he mastered the machine. At Grosse Pointe in October 1902, the 999 defeated Alexander Winton, the most successful racing driver in America at the time. The victory made headlines across the country. Henry Ford suddenly had something more valuable than money. He had a reputation. On June 16, 1903, Ford and 12 investors incorporated the Ford Motor Company with $28,000 in cash. Ford owned 25.5% of the new enterprise. He was not yet the dominant figure he would become, but he had learned from his previous failures. This time, he would balance his perfectionism with the practical demands of commerce. The company sold its first car on July 15, 1903. Over the next 5 years, Ford and his engineers produced a succession of models, each identified by a letter of the alphabet. The Model N, priced at $600, proved that Americans would buy automobiles if the price was right. In October 1908, the Ford Motor Company introduced the Model T. Everything Ford had learned about manufacturing, pricing, and what ordinary Americans actually needed came together in this single vehicle. The Model T was not elegant, and it was not fast. The suspension rattled over rough roads, and the hand crank could break an arm if it kicked back, but it was simple enough that farmers could repair it themselves. It was tough enough to handle the rutted dirt paths that passed for roads in rural America, and cheap enough that working families could imagine owning one. Within months of its release, demand exceeded anything Ford could produce. Building excellent cars meant nothing if he could not build enough of them. Each vehicle assembled by hand required skilled craftsmen working at their own pace. Production bottlenecks appeared everywhere, and customers waited months for delivery. Ford needed a revolution in manufacturing to match his revolution in design. He found inspiration in Chicago meatpacking plants, which used overhead conveyors to move animal carcasses past workers. Ford's engineers realized the principle could work in reverse. In 1910, Ford opened a new factory in Highland Park, Michigan. Designed by architect Albert Kahn, the plant featured massive windows that flooded work areas with natural light. Inside those walls, his engineers began experimenting. In April 1913, they tried moving a magneto flywheel assembly down a line of workers, each man adding one component before pushing it to the next station. Production time dropped from 20 minutes to 13, and further refinements cut it to 5. By the end of 1913, Ford had applied the moving assembly line to the entire chassis. Workers no longer walked to their tasks, the tasks came to them on a continuous chain. A complete Model T now emerged from the factory every 93 minutes. Under the old stationary methods, the same car had required over 12 hours. The price of the Model T fell accordingly, $850 at launch, $550 by 1913, and as low as $260 by 1927. Between 1908 and 1927, Ford produced over 15 million Model T automobiles. The car transformed American geography, commerce, and courtship. Henry Ford did not merely build cars, he built the 20th century. But the assembly line came with costs he had not anticipated. The relentless pace and monotony turned skilled craftsmen into interchangeable parts of a human machine. Workers began leaving as fast as Ford could hire them, leading to an annual turnover exceeding 380% by late 1913. On January 5, 1914, Henry Ford made an announcement that turned him into a national phenomenon. The company would pay its workers $5 a day. Factory workers across America typically earned between $2 and $3. Ford proposed to more than double their wages while reducing their shift to 8 hours. The Wall Street Journal called it a crime against the natural order of business, but Ford's reasons were not sentimental. The $5 day solved the turnover problem instantly. When Ford opened his employment office the next morning, 10,000 men stood waiting in the January cold. Inside the factory, everything changed. Productivity soared, and workers who had once watched the clock now competed for the privilege of staying. However, the wage came with a catch. Workers had to prove they deserved the bonus by submitting to investigation by Ford's sociological department. Inspectors visited homes without warning, checked bank accounts, and checked for signs of drinking or gambling. They required employees to keep their houses clean and their habits respectable. Ford believed he was teaching men to become better citizens. While many resented the intrusion, they endured it for the money. Ford had proven that high wages could be good business, and within 2 years, company profits doubled to $60 million. Henry Ford had made himself the most famous industrialist on earth, but fame brought a loss of privacy that would soon drive him away from the city. The house on Edison Avenue had been everything Henry and Clara Ford wanted when they built it in 1908. With 7,000 square feet of Italian Renaissance elegance in Detroit's most prestigious neighborhood, it featured a workshop above the garage where young Edsel could tinker with engines and gardens designed by the finest landscape architects. For 7 years, it was their sanctuary. Then came the $5 day. Within hours of the announcement, the quiet street became impassable. Job seekers lined the sidewalk outside their door, and strangers appeared on their front porch at all hours, begging for work or demanding to speak with Henry. The Fords could not leave their own house without being surrounded by a mob of hopeful or desperate faces. Fame had made their life in the city unbearable. Clara had endured much, the ridicule of neighbors when Henry was just a crazy tinkerer and the financial uncertainty of his early failed ventures, but this invasion of their privacy was something neither could accept. They began looking for land far outside the city limits, and Henry knew exactly where he wanted to go. 2 miles from his birthplace, along a stretch of the Rouge River that he had known since childhood, lay farmland that still looked much as it had when his father first cleared it. Between 1908 and 1910, Ford quietly purchased more than 1,300 acres of woods, meadows, and working farms. To Henry, it felt less like buying real estate than reclaiming a birthright. Clara shared this sentiment. She had grown up on a farm not far from the Ford family, and the Rouge River Valley was home in a way that the fashionable lakeside estates of other Detroit millionaires could never be. In the summer of 1912, while architects began drawing plans, Henry and Clara sailed for Europe. Ford wanted to visit his factories in England, but he also felt a deep pull toward Ireland. His father, William, had fled the famine in 1847, and his mother, Mary, had been raised by a Cork family named Ahern. In Cork City, Ford searched parish records and found the baptismal entry for Patrick Ahern, the man who had raised his mother. Ahern had been born in 1804 on a narrow street called Fair Lane. When Henry visited the one-room stone cottage his grandfather had left behind in Balliniscarthy, he tried to buy the entire structure to ship it to America. When the price proved too high even for him, he instead purchased the original hearthstones from the fireplace. He would later build those stones into the walls of his new home, a physical anchor to his ancestral past. When the estate was finally completed in 1915, Henry and Clara gave it the name that connected them to their heritage and the country their ancestors had fled. They called it Fair Lane. However, the path to finishing the house was as turbulent as the river beside it. Henry originally approached Frank Lloyd Wright, the most famous architect in America, to design the home. Wright's prairie style, with its horizontal lines that seemed to grow out of the earth, would have been a perfect fit for the Michigan landscape. But in 1909, Wright abandoned his family and his studio to flee to Europe with the client's wife. The scandal ended the partnership before it began. The commission passed to Herman von Holst, who sought out the person who understood Wright's design philosophy better than anyone else, Marion Mahoney. In an era when almost no women practiced architecture, Mahoney was a pioneer, having been the first woman licensed in Illinois and Wright's secret weapon for 14 years. She accepted the project on the condition that she have complete control. She developed a vision for a prairie-style masterpiece on the banks of the Rouge River, with bands of windows that dissolved the boundary between the interior and the forest. Yet, in February 1914, the Fords rejected her final rendering. The reasons remain a mystery. Some cite disputes over contractors, while others believe Clara wanted something more traditional and English. The Fords dismissed Mahoney and hired William Van Tyne, an interior designer from Pittsburgh with no significant architectural credentials. Van Tyne took Mahoney's layout but added the medieval touches Clara admired, a round castellated tower on the riverside, stepped parapets, and Gothic details. The result was a Prairie Gothic villa, a massive 31,000 square foot structure of Indiana limestone. Construction was a monumental task, involving 56 rooms, walls up to 24 inches thick, 8 fireplaces, and an indoor swimming pool. The total cost exceeded $1 million, an astronomical sum for 1915. While Mahoney went on to international fame designing the capital of Australia, the house the Fords finally occupied bore the marks of her original genius hidden beneath Van Tyne's stone flourishes. It was a house that belonged to its setting, a limestone fortress that looked as though it had been carved out of the riverbank itself, ready to protect the world's most famous man from the very public that had made him rich. In November 1915, Henry and Clara Ford finally moved into Fair Lane. After nearly 2 years of construction, architectural disputes, and a parade of contractors, the house was ready. But the building they occupied was far more than a luxury residence. It was a complex, self-sustaining machine. To understand Fair Lane, one must understand the friendship that shaped its mechanical heart. In August 1896, a young Henry Ford had attended a convention in Brooklyn where he met Thomas Edison. When Ford sketched his gasoline engine design on a menu card, Edison had slammed his fist on the table in encouragement, telling the young engineer that he had the right idea. That moment forged a bond that would last 35 years. When Ford began planning his estate, he turned to his mentor to help design the powerhouse that would make the property independent of the outside world. Edison helped create a hydroelectric generating system unlike anything ever built for a private residence. Workers constructed a massive dam across the Rouge River, diverting the flow of water into a 4-story limestone powerhouse that matched the mansion in craftsmanship. Inside, 2 massive turbines spun continuously, driven by the current of the river. These generators produced 110 kilowatts of electricity, enough to light the entire 1,300-acre estate and still feed surplus power back into the municipal grid of Dearborn. This was the ultimate expression of Ford's obsession with self-sufficiency. He didn't just want to live in the countryside. He wanted to control his own environment, free from the failures of public utilities or the interference of others. Shutterstock. The powerhouse was not merely a utility building, it was Henry's true sanctuary. The ground floor contained a 12-car garage equipped with a massive automotive turntable, allowing Ford to store and retrieve his favorite vehicles without ever having to shift into reverse, a nod to his first primitive designs. Above the garage, Ford built a private laboratory where he could escape the demands of the Ford Motor Company. He installed a heavy security gate on the stairs and allowed only his most trusted associates to enter. For decades, that room remained a mystery to the outside world, a place where the man who changed the 20th century could return to being a simple tinkerer. A 300-foot underground tunnel connected this powerhouse to the main residence. The passageway, with its arched stone walls, ran beneath the gardens, allowing staff to move supplies and fuel without disturbing the tranquility of the grounds. This obsession with independence was rooted in Ford's childhood. He had watched his mother die when he was 12 and seen his father struggle to keep their farm running. To Ford, dependence was a form of vulnerability. At Fair Lane, he was a king in a self-contained realm. The greenhouse provided fresh vegetables in the dead of Michigan winters, and the working farm produced all the meat and dairy the family required. While Clara preferred the sunlit music room of the main house, where she hosted elegant dances and recitals, Henry spent his happiest hours in the powerhouse, surrounded by the smell of oil and the low hum of machinery. The turbines still spin today, more than a century after they were installed, a testament to the engineering brilliance of two of history's greatest inventors. Yet, even a man who trusted machines above all else understood the need for a connection to the earth. To transform the worn-out farmland surrounding the house into a work of art, Ford hired Jens Jensen, a Danish-born landscape architect who rejected the formal, stiff gardens of Europe. Jensen believed in the beauty of the American prairie and the Midwestern forest. He worked at Fair Lane from 1914 to 1920, planting thousands of native oaks, hawthorns, and wildflowers. He didn't want the grounds to look designed, he wanted them to look as if they had existed for 1,000 years, waiting for the house to emerge from the limestone. Jensen's most famous contribution was the Great Meadow, a long, sweeping expanse of grass designed with the precision of an astronomical clock. He aligned the meadow so that on the summer solstice, the setting sun would glow through a specific gap in the trees, bathing the entire landscape in a divine, golden light. For a man like Ford, who valued both nature and precision, this was the perfect marriage of the two. Despite the grandeur of the Great Meadow and the technical marvel of the powerhouse, Fair Lane was ultimately a place of quiet retreat. Henry and Clara Ford lived there for over 30 years, finding a balance between the global empire Henry had built and the simple rural life they both craved. Clara spent her days in her massive rose garden, which eventually featured over 10,000 plants, while Henry could often be found walking the trails or watching the hundreds of birds for which he had built custom houses. He even installed heaters in the bird baths so the water wouldn't freeze during Michigan's brutal winters. To the world, he was the billionaire industrialist, but at Fair Lane, he was a man who preferred a simple meal of roadside greens and the company of his wife. However, the world outside was changing, and time was catching up with the creator of the Model T. The 1930s and 1940s brought labor unrest, the Great Depression, and the immense pressure of World War II, during which Ford's factories became the arsenal of democracy. Through it all, Fair Lane remained their fortress. But by 1947, the man who had outpaced his competitors for decades could no longer outrun his own mortality. The irony of his final night remains one of the most poignant moments in industrial history. Henry Ford had spent his life trying to master nature through technology. He had built Fair Lane to be the ultimate proof that a man could provide for himself, independent of the flaws of human society. On that dark April night, the Rouge River, the very source of his power, reclaimed its dominance. The flood didn't just cut off the electricity, it severed the connection to the modern world Ford had helped create. Without the telephone, Clara was forced to rely on a horse-drawn era method, sending a man out into the storm to find help. There were no bright hospital lights, no humming medical machines. As the water rushed past the stone walls of Fair Lane, Henry Ford's world shrank to the size of a single candle-lit room. He died at 11:40 p.m., with the sound of the river in his ears, returning to the silence from which he had come. After Henry's death, Clara remained in the house until she passed away in 1950. For a time, the future of Fair Lane was uncertain. Many Gilded Age mansions faced the wrecking ball as the cost of maintenance became impossible for heirs to manage. In 1952, the Ford Motor Company purchased the estate and used it for offices and archives, but by the late 1950s, there were talks of demolition to make way for new developments. It was only through the intervention of the Ford family and the University of Michigan that the house was saved. They recognized that Fair Lane was not just a residence, it was a physical manifestation of the American dream, and its complexities. Today, Fair Lane stands as a National Historic Landmark, undergoing extensive restoration to return it to the exact state it was in during the Ford's residency. Visitors can walk the underground tunnel, stand beside the massive Edison turbines in the powerhouse, and look out over the great meadow where the sun still aligns perfectly every solstice. The house survived the threat of demolition against all odds, much like Henry Ford himself survived the early failures of his career. It remains a monument to a man who was both a genius and a contradiction, a man who transformed the world but in the end, found his only peace behind the limestone walls of a house built by a river. Quote,